Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Margaret. I'm teaching faculty here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And for recording purposes, today is Wednesday, April 10th. It is 9:00 a.m. And this is panel number, 18036. Okay. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Okay, one other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you all get a chance to ask questions. And so how we'll handle the Q&A is that we'll reserve that for the end. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. So at any time during the session, if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. One of the producers will come around and give you a card. Those will come up here to me. Please write legibly. Make it easy for me, please. And I urge everyone to make your questions just brief and direct. And now I will introduce our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. So first to my left, we have Heidi Basch-Harod. Heidi is the executive director of Women's Voices Now, a nonprofit organization in Los Angeles that uses film to drive social change to advance girls' and women's rights globally. They strive to bring people from empathy to action. For all of the panelists, if you want the longer bio, those are available on the website. I'm going to keep it quick here. And next we have Rengin Firat, who is tenure-track faculty, a neuroscientist with over 10 years experience conducting research on interpersonal behavior and group dynamics. She has been tenure-track faculty at the University of California, Riverside, and now at Georgia State, where her work focuses on racialized violence in the South. Thank you. And next, we have Ted Schmitt, who is the Senior Director of Conservation at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. For over 15 years, he has led efforts to bring appropriate technology solutions for a range of terrestrial and marine conservation issues. And Ted on our panel will be focusing on empathizing with wildlife. Has an engineering degree, German language and literature, and he is the chair of the Purdue University School of Language and Culture Advisory Board. Thanks, Ted. And up next, we have Tashiro, who is an author, psychologist, and relationship expert. Author of many books, and today he's going to focus on talking a bit about his book titled Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. Okay, and so we'll start it off with just a little statement from folks running down the line here. So Heidi, can you talk to us a little bit about how you would define empathy and then the applications of that to your work?
Yes, thank you, Annie. First, good morning to everyone. There are so many interesting panels happening right now, so thank you for choosing our panel and to take some time to explore empathy and how it can make our world a better place. I'm going to start by just telling a little story about how I first understood empathy and how this idea of, as I like to say, being able to walk around in someone else's shoes sort of directed my life journey. So I was 10 years old, and I was in the 6th grade, and we were assigned the book The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen, which is a fictional novel about the Holocaust, about lots of different experiences together. And from that, I understood that I had a grandfather who was a Holocaust survivor. I invited him to speak to my 6th grade class, and it was the first time I'd ever heard his story. And I remember being devastated by listening to what he had experienced, the loss that he felt, and how that juxtaposed with the joyful person that I knew, who didn't have a shred of hatred in his body for anyone, and who was welcoming and open to anyone who ever came across him. And I went home that night and I said, I am going to continue that work that he does. Again, I was 10 years old, but I knew it. And I'm like, I'm going to make the world a better place. And there's something to do with feeling what other people feel, that if we really feel each other, we can't harm each other. Fast forward to 2007, I went to Israel to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm sorry, I failed, but it was my empathy for the other that brought me there to try to really understand the complexity of this conflict, and that I couldn't close my heart to quote unquote the enemy, and I had to really get in there. And then fast forward to the work that I do with Women's Voices now since 2012, where there's no doubt in my mind that without empathy, we do not have our humanity, and without empathy, we cannot achieve our greatest existence as human beings, that we can make all the changes, when we're talking about women's rights, we can make all the changes in the world, to the laws, to access to education, to political representation, on and on and on. But if in our DNA, in our heart, our blood, and our bones, if we don't feel the pain of someone else who's being held back because of their gender, the color of their skin, on and on and on, that change that comes from the top down, it will never really be a real thing. It can be taken away. It will backslide, as we're kind of seeing right now in this country and around the world. So in order to change culture, which is really where we have to make the change, so that what happens on the top meets what happens from the bottom up, and then we are better people for it, you have to feel another person's pain and experience as though it is your own. And so that's the way I wanted to open this up, and I will kick it over to Rengin.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, I really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, this morning. And I really like that you're talking about feelings and emotions, because that's what I wanted to emphasize as well. So my background is in basic research. So I'm a social scientist, but I'm also a neuroscientist. I'm a neurosociologist. I've been studying the brain in the last 2 decades or so, and trying to understand brain's role in human empathy, intergroup relationships, and social biases. And one of the key distinctions in empathy and research on empathy is that the way that our brain processes work is that we distinguish between the cognitive parts of empathy and the emotional empathy. And cognitive empathy is understanding another person's perspective. We also call it a theory of mind, having a theory of other people's minds, what the other person is thinking. Right now, when I'm looking at you, at the audience, I'm thinking that you're listening to me, right? So my understanding of your actions, your perceptions. Emotional empathy is what I think or what I feel that you feel. Are you enjoying this conversation? Or are you not? Are you having a good time? Are you not? That our feelings are very important in empathy. Cognitive empathy develops in humans around the age of 3 or so. Right? Kids have an understanding of this cognitive empathy, what the other people are thinking. It starts around the age of 3. And we study this with experiments. For example, to a very young kid, if you show them a chocolate bar, which they love, right, and you hide it in a drawer, you hide it in a place when they're watching, when you ask them, where is the chocolate? They know where it is. But if you tell them there is another person, like Heidi is here, Heidi left the room, and I hide this chocolate in the same spots. When I ask that kid, if they are very young, where does Heidi think this chocolate bar is, they still point at the same location. So this understanding that Heidi would not know where the chocolate bar is because she left the room is cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy starts much earlier, right? Emotional empathy, newborns cry when another baby cries. There is a lot of experimental research that shows that newborns do not cry in response to another animal's cry, but they respond to other human babies' cries. This is also called emotional contagion. So our brain processes, the emotional parts of our brains develop earlier than the more cognitive parts of our brain. They're more core, so we feel them strongly. So emotional empathy is a stronger driver of a lot of human perception, group relationships. So the feelings are very important. And in a lot of my research, I focused on this emotional components of social perceptions and biases. And what I observed, what I found in a lot of my research is that emotional parts of our brain respond in a very nuanced way to social groups. So these moral emotional responses in our brain in a way drive our empathy, our boundaries. In social science literature, we also call these moral boundaries. The way that we draw boundaries to distinguish groups, to determine our in-groups, who's in our in-group and who's in our out-group. And our feelings distinguish the boundaries, the groups, are the way we feel towards other groups. And it's actually very automatic, it's very fast oftentimes. And I think if we want to improve empathy, cognitive empathy is very important, understanding other people's perceptions, right? If somebody is from a different culture, the way that they might speak, what they eat, the music they listen, understanding is very important. But the core of changing and improving group relationships is changing the emotions, changing the feelings. And that is the harder part. That is the more difficult part. Without having that emotional empathy and feeling side, cognitive empathy is not enough or sufficient to improve group relationships. So that's what a lot of my research shows and finds. And it is our empathy for other humans, or lack of empathy, is also tied to our actual feelings towards animals. So I wanted to tie to that as well. Like dehumanization, for example. We talk about dehumanization because one of the key mechanisms, again, tied to moral emotions, is that for out groups, if people don't like other out groups, they see them as less of a human. And there are certain moral emotional brain processes are involved in that. So this is called dehumanization. So seeing them as less of a human, not feeling moral emotional feelings, not feeling sympathy, not feeling pride, or even guilt or embarrassment. So not attributing these moral emotions to other groups. And I think this might tie to our emotions to other animals as well, and how we feel about them. And I would like to give the floor to Ted.
Thank you. That was a nice, I don't know if you wanted to say anything in between, but thank you for that handoff. Actually, I hadn't thought about the word dehumanization and how it's not the right word, actually, because we should have empathy for all living things. We were talking as a panel beforehand, and I asked who's hugged a tree? Like, who's literally hugged a tree? You should do it if you haven't done it. It's an emotional experience. It creates empathy. I had the good fortune last week to celebrate Jane Goodall's 90th birthday with her, which was an amazing experience. She told a story I'm sure she's told countless times about how Louis Leakey picked her to observe the chimps that she observed in Tanzania. I'm sure some of you have probably even heard that story. She was not a trained scientist. He specifically wanted someone who hadn't been indoctrinated in the orthodoxy. And she observed fear, she observed happiness, joy, emotion, tool making, all the things that we attribute to humans. And at the time when she did those observations, it was basically taboo to attribute those things to anything but humans, because humans were separate from the rest of the world and we were special. Unique. She was not welcomed by the scientific community for those observations at the time, and yet now that has changed very much how we approach thinking about animals. And I like to think about I've been doing a lot of thinking about systems and thinking in systems. I don't know if any of you know Donella Meadows and her writing on thinking in systems. And when I think about empathy, I think about, instead of reducing how we look at a human or an animal to its parts, to it did this behavior or that behavior, it has this skin color, it has this type of hair. If we think about it as a living system that has emergent behaviors, that's where we make an emotional connection, and that's where we create empathy. If we reduce things to our parts, and I think thinking about the Holocaust, I mean, that's exactly what was done. It was dehumanizing, to use that word. It was turning people into their parts and not into a living, breathing, feeling being. And so I think that's what I wanted to talk about with empathy and animals. I've actually had a journey myself. I started my career as an engineer, and I remember getting a few years into an engineering career was fine, and I've worked my whole life with engineers, I still do, but I remember getting really curious about what problems we were solving with the things we were building, and caring about the problems that people were having, that we're having on the impact we're having on the planet. And a feedback I got from a lot of the engineers was, why do you care? I just like building cool stuff. And I thought, wow, I'm not in the right profession. So, and that's certainly not true of all engineers, but they do love solving things, and give them problems to solve. But I really wanted to understand the problems deeply. And I think that's a lot of what the panelists here are talking about, is understanding, and then understanding drives empathy and drives ways to approach things differently, and solutions to that. And so I did a journey from engineer to policy. I also studied in Germany, and I have a German language and literature degree. I have an engineering degree. I think interdisciplinary studies are also very important to create understanding and empathy. I now spend a lot of time in Africa, and that experience of living abroad as a young person really opened my mind to recognizing that people think very differently, and trying to understand that. And then I refer to myself often as the accidental conservationist. I even have a website I've created, Accidental Conservationist, because I really fell into to conservation and love of animals and nature sort of almost by accident, because I wanted to see technology and science applied in ways that did good in the world, that showed empathy. Technology and science really aren't good or bad, they just are. And it's how we as humans feel our values, how we reflect our values, that determines whether the technology and the science gets used for good or bad. And it just happened that I ended up working for someone who was very interested in wildlife and recognized how poorly science and technology were being applied to protect the other species on the planet that I think we should love just as much as we love all the humans. So I will stop there, but that's where I come from, and I'll hand it off to you.
All right, thank you. So psychologists have looked at gender differences, sex differences, and empathy. No surprise, men do worse than women, a lot worse than women do. And this prevailed through the 1960s, 1970s. They saw these profound gender differences in both cognitive and emotional empathy. An interesting series of studies started in the mid-1970s where, the explanation for these findings were that men were less capable of empathizing. There was this great study where they randomly assigned men and women, right, to receive $5 or no money, so compensation or no compensation. When they paid men $5, they did just as well as the women did, okay? So there's a difference between ability and a difference between motivation. And that's kind of an axis I'd like to break down here. So, sometimes we're just not motivated to be empathic because as you've all experienced, I'm sure, the times when you've really been patient and you really took the time to truly understand another person's position, oftentimes it's a lot harder, right, than you thought it was. The depths of it go much deeper than you ever imagined. And there's a lot of emotional labor in that. And it's actually hard, right? It's really hard to do that. I don't practice psychotherapy these days, and part of the reason is because I couldn't stop at the end of the day. I'd take the stuff home with me. And a great therapist is able to stop it at 5 o'clock and live their normal life. For a lot of people, it's just hard to stop the empathy, right? And the emotional labor continues on. So there's a motivation part of it. So if you have a male partner, they're making the excuse that they're just don't have the ability to empathize. That's not true. They just need to have the motivation. Now, something else that's been interesting, I think, is the ability side of it. I spent a few years looking into the social science about social awkwardness, so socially awkward people. And awkward people have a tough time with empathizing compared to people who are socially fluent or socially adept. Now, why is that the case? You might think, well, they're just not motivated, which is a fine hypothesis. But what hundreds of studies have actually shown now is that socially awkward people, they just process social information differently, entirely differently compared to other folks. And so if you, I don't want to get too far on my lane here because we have a real neuroscientist here, but if you watch fMRI, so if you watch the brain in motion, and you watch socially fluent people process social information, they tend to do it in a more top-down kind of way, right? They just kind of have a broad objective, and then they improvise in the interaction as you should to reach that objective. Let's get along here. Let's resolve a problem here. Awkward people, on the other hand, look like they're solving a math problem or like they're putting together a puzzle. They're going bottom up, taking each individual piece of information and then furiously trying to aggregate those into a coherent whole. And if you love an awkward person, and you probably do, because they're about 15-20% of the population, you probably observe that, right? Sometimes if you just give them a sec, and give them a little time to get their head around it, give their brain a chance to catch up, right? Then they come through. And sometimes in ways that are really gratifying. Sometimes in odd ways. I think about the engineers sometimes building the shed for their partner or something, and that's their great act of empathy, right, to show it, which is an unusual way. But in the display of empathy and how we receive that and receive the other person's intent, which I think is so important with empathy when we think about motivation and ability. That intent piece is really important, and sometimes we just need to give people some time to situate themselves into understanding what it is we want them to understand, right? And I think it's so hard sometimes because no one knows you better than you know yourself. You've lived with yourself, you've ruminated over and over about these things. This other person is fresh to this, and kind of like the awkward person, they're trying to catch up, right? And so I think in this era where we can be so outraged so easily and so easily frustrated with other people, sometimes just a bit of time can go a long ways.
Thank you. So my work focuses on studying how social technologies impact our capacity for connection. When I hear you talking about the resources and the motivation, particularly the last thing you said about frustration, I just want to bring up this concept of the way that when we engage with people online, the algorithm amplifies the most horrifying thing they've ever said, right? And to your point, Ted, about seeing people as a full system, right? The way our technologies don't really enable that. And so the question I want to ask is, first I'm going to start by reiterating the framework that was given to us. So the three aspects of empathy. So if we have cognitive empathy, which is a theory of mind, understanding what someone else is thinking. Then we have emotional empathy, which are emotional contagion, taking on the emotions of that other person. And then compassion, which I think is what Heidi was referring to here, is bringing that into action, right? What do we do to improve other people's circumstances? And a while ago, there was a really popular kind of idea in the media around we're experiencing an empathy deficit, right? That's the problem here. We all have an empathy deficit. And when I think about that in the context of what I study with social technologies, we evolved to handle the empathy and suffering of a certain number of people. Now we have access to the suffering of millions, if not billions, of people in our pocket at any moment. And so do we have an empathy deficit, or are we empathically overwhelmed by the amount of suffering that we can access? And so I bring that up to, I was hoping we could kind of go down the line here and discuss that concept. And also, if you have anything from your own research or work to inform people about how we spend those resources, right? Our cognitive empathy resources. Because to your point, it is a lot of work, right? That emotional empathy. So if we think of those as resources, sort of reframe the question in case I lost you there. How do we advise or insight into how we allocate our resources? And then if you have any thoughts on this sort of idea of whether it's an empathy deficit or whether we are in fact empathically overwhelmed or somewhere in between. We can just head down the line. Thanks.
I think that we're empathically overwhelmed, for sure. There's no question in my mind. How do we even do anything about the immense suffering that we're constantly being bombarded with as it's happening before we even know what's even happening? So I can speak to my work with Women's Voices now, where we use film to build empathy in people and then ask them to go out into the world to make that change. And it's really interesting because in my work I see all the places where the empathy is needed, and then how irresponsible it is if you don't give people an action to carry out in order to practice that empathy and feel like I did something, right? And again, I don't know if you know that story of like the young person walking on the beach throwing starfish at a very abnormally low tide into the water, and someone else is coming up the other direction. You can't get to them all. Like, why are you even trying? They throw that starfish into the sea and say, well, it made a difference to that one, right? So I'm a big believer of like, you do what you can. You're not obligated to do all of it, but you take the step that you can. Super important than not. So I see in the world, there's empathic overwhelmment. That's not the right term, but it happens with ourselves. So I always think of an example of a film that we used to show in our work called In Search of America, Inshallah, about a young woman from Pakistan who was in an arranged marriage, and her husband was sent to America, and he said, I will come back for you, and he didn't. She ends up going out to the United States, to Los Angeles, to find that he has been with another woman, and he had no intention of ever going back to her. And I will never forget the night in Venice, California, when this woman came up to me after the film and said, and there was a speaker that night, a South Asian woman, who talked about healthy relationships with husbands and how important it is to stand your ground, and that being ignored, being neglected, this is not okay, even if you're supposed to swallow it and be all right with that. And she came up to me after that program, and I could see the wrinkles in her face soften. And she just said, I didn't know that we could talk about these things. I didn't know that I had a right to the feelings that I'm having, that I can live a different life, that I can say to my husband, this is not okay with me. I don't want to be in this relationship with you if this is how it's going to be carried out. So sometimes we need the empathy on ourselves. And then of course there's when we see a film or something about a global conflict, and there is something we can do at the end, which is find an organization to support, volunteer with it, help get the message around, sign a petition. Again, small little acts of things, but I think it helps with the being overwhelmed. And once we have that, other people on this panel can talk about the hit that we get in the brain and the endorphins and stuff of doing something for others. The Dalai Lama has a famous saying, the purpose of our lives is to make other people happy, and that will bring us happiness and contentment. I believe in that wholly. So we can deal with that. We don't have to be overwhelmed. We have a choice, right? We can have the cognitive understanding that yes, there's a lot happening in the world. Yes, it's a lot of emotional labor. Yes, I'm being asked to feel for a lot. But what do I feel today I can make the most difference in, and what can I do to make a difference about that? And I do think, again, it's the responsibility of those of us who are asking for the people of the world to make the change to give very direct calls to action, or else it is totally impossible to handle all the misery that is happening today.
Thank you, Heidi. Yes. And I totally agree with you. And I think the empathy deficit, Annie, that you talked about, I see it as I divide it into two. I see it as two different concepts. The first one is moral disengagement. So I also call it moral apathy, not feeling empathy towards certain groups. And we do it all the time, because sometimes we see it on the social media, or sometimes that we see it on the TV. It's a group that might not be closely related to us. It might be another country, it might be another culture, a group that we're not interacting. And that dampened emotional sensitivity, not feeling certain emotions, moral emotions towards that group, I call this moral apathy, right? Not being able to feel or resonate. And I don't think this is the empathy deficit that you're talking about, Annie, but I see it as one still important part of it. And this is, I think, maybe what Heidi was talking about. And I think this is the empathy deficit that we should counter and fight against, because it's important for us humans to emotionally be selective and be active and be proactive and help other humans, right? How do we derive value? How do we derive meaning from our lives? It's very important to have this intrinsic motivation and value and doing something good. There's a lot of research that shows doing good makes people happy. It helps us, it helps other people. So, and part of this is also countering this by reducing moral in-group glorification. So humans, we tend to glorify, we like our in-groups more. And that's a part of our normal ways that our brains operate. And we can change it by changing our moral groups, moral in-groups, by expanding our moral boundaries. So this is, I think, one side of it and one way of countering this moral apathy or moral deficit. But the other side of it is empathy or compassion burnout, right? Maybe this is what you were talking about more, that's being burnt out from compassion and empathy. A lot of nurses, first responders, especially during COVID, went through this, right? Helping other people, being on the ground, just so much empathy, trying to help other people. This might lead to compassion burnout, right? This might lead to exhaustion in the person over time, heightened stress, heightened cortisol in our bodies. And this is also important to manage in your daily lives. If you have to be compassionate, if you are working and helping other people all the time, you also need to take care of yourself. And one strategy for this could be disengagement from time to time. Not all the time, but maybe certain times. Maybe time what you're talking about, right? Being a good therapist, stopping that after 5 p.m. and not thinking about work. It's hard, it's so hard. But being able to do that. So there are different emotional strategies for that. But sometimes keeping a distance from certain stimulants might help with that compassion burnout as well, especially with social media or other information. And I do it. There are certain things I can't watch. I can't look. I'm overloaded. And it's okay to sometimes just shut it off. Look at yourselves. Practicing mindfulness, for example, mindfulness and meditation for yourself. And that helps in the long run your connection with other peoples. So it doesn't mean detaching from the world, but just leaving some time for yourselves. So that would be one resource or one strategy that I would recommend, I think, helping with compassion burnout.
Okay. I think one thing that I see a lot is that people are thinking about what they want to do, and I don't mean sort of narcissism in a I don't even know what the clinical sense of that is, but I don't mean it in that sense. But we all are sort of focused on ourselves, and I always talk about where is this person coming from, what is motivating them, what are their values, and not what do they say, but what do they do, and I think like. With wildlife and with conservation, it's actually quite interesting and ironic that a lot of conservationists get very focused on saving animals and aren't thinking about the people that are living in a lot of places where the animals are, the indigenous people, the local communities around these places. They get very caught up in things. I'll give a very specific example with hunting. I don't like trophy hunting. I don't think it's necessary this day and age. And yet, why is it that some indigenous communities still want to have trophy hunting? What is motivating them? And if you ask that question, if you ask it with an open mind and understand where they're coming from, it's mostly about that it's a way to feed themselves. It may even be something to do with their traditional values. And so, but asking them and then bringing them on a journey to where you want them to be by understanding where they are and coming to them rather than forcing a solution on them and forcing your values on them. And I think I see that a lot. I don't know that I'm articulating it very well, but we spend a lot of time trying to force our values on other people. However good we think our motivation of our values is, we need to really try and understand and empathize with other people's values and where they are, and then we can bring them, and we'll probably bring ourselves on that journey too, to a good place for everyone. And so I think when I think about being overwhelmed by, I'm trying to do something good and there's all this resistance, it's like, well, why is there the resistance? What is it that I have to, why am I frustrated by that? And so then by asking, where are the other people, and how do I get them to where to a place closer to my values by understanding their values? I think that's one way I address being frustrated or overwhelmed. So.
I love that idea, Ted, of getting your ego and your assumptions in check first, right, before you embark on it. I think that's so critical. And Heidi and Rengin, I just, the cruelty of not giving people a behavior, right, or some call to action to be able then to do something about it, I think is so important to recognize and important to think about with this. One kind of thing that came up for me comes from couples research. And we oftentimes think of empathy as empathizing with something that's hard for somebody else, which obviously is true, right? That's a major part of empathy. There's been this idea recently called capitalization, and capitalization comes from social psychology. It's this idea about, well, what if you empathize with something good about somebody else? And what are the effects of that? So they looked at romantic couples in these studies, and they tracked them with daily diary studies where they got their relationship satisfaction and their emotions every day across the course of many weeks. And what they found was that 87% of the time with couples cohabitating, one partner came home at least and had something good happen that day that they shared with their partner. Now, here's the opportunity to capitalize. Have you ever done that? You come home, you tell somebody something, and they're just like flipping through the channels and could care less about the good thing that happened? Capitalization is the opposite of that. So what happens is, in a responsive partner, they have the cognitive empathy, so they say, that's great that X, Y, and Z happened. But importantly, their emotional response, the emotional empathy, had to match the intensity of the person who was the sharer. Now, when they capitalized on these positive events like this, the effects were tremendous. They were just as good as empathizing with negative information that the partner shared. Interestingly, they provided boosts not only that evening, but also 3 days later, and there were lagging effects 2 weeks and 3 weeks later. So, this idea of building positive resources through empathizing with things that are good that happen in the world and good that happen with people might be one way to balance out some of that fatigue or some of that burden, emotional burden that we can feel with empathy. And you all know what that's like, right? Isn't it nice when you share something with somebody and they're just so pumped and psyched for you in a genuine kind of way? So I think maybe broadening our view of what can be empathized with is one other technique that we could use.
Thank you. That is such good advice. I know exactly what you're talking about, Ty. Thank you. And I also wanted to say something to your point. This is a story I love to tell in class, and I think it's pertinent here, so I'm going to indulge myself for a moment. This idea of our in-group and how we can change that to include more humans, and you were speaking to the meditation practices. So there's actually, are you familiar with Liverpool and Manchester United? If you're not, this is a very iconic rivalry. And so the concept of priming who our in-group is, and so the way they do this study is they have people come in and they think that the experiment is to write an essay. They say, please write an essay about how much you love Manchester United. And then we're going to evaluate your essay. And so they sit and they write their essay, and they go out, and there's a guy in a Liverpool jersey who's fallen and twisted an ankle. And they see how many people now will stop and help the Liverpool guy. I don't have my notes in front of me, but it's something like 30%. And then they do the same experiment, and they say, write an essay about how much you love soccer, football, if you're not an American. And so they write their essay, and then they go back out again, and now there's the Liverpool guy again, Now something like 90% of people stop to help because they've primed themselves to believe my in-group is all people who love football as much as I do. It's not just my team. And I like to tell this story because I think it's a really good example of what you're talking about, where we can actually do practices to change how we're viewing who our in-group is. Thank you. All right, well, we'll just start with some of these. I don't know, they came here. Let's do it. Okay, let's see what I can do here. How about the need to help individuals develop empathy for oneself? And I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit so sort of the self-compassion question. Awareness of their thoughts and feelings and their connection to themselves. This looks like this comes from someone specifically interested in K-12 and relationship education. So I think maybe we'll do Rengin and Ty for that one, it sounds like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting question.
And anybody else is welcome to hop in too. I'm just trying to.
Yeah. So I'll tell you my initial reaction to that. I like that the K through 12 was emphasized there, because my initial reaction for adults was, I don't think we need to think about ourselves any more than we do. We're such a self-focused age right now. It might be detrimental. But for kids, I think especially because kids had the COVID thing, which certainly we're seeing now has had an impact on their social development and their psychological development. And it's hard, right? Because that old adage of the defining ourselves a bit through how other people see us is, it's not totally true, but it's certainly partially true. And so kids were isolated and didn't have this chance to bounce their self off of other people and get reactions to that. So, yeah, I don't know how you, but I guess the thing is I don't know how you make that up. And I don't want to be overly pessimistic about this, but one thing that I've heard from folks when I've been at schools lately is that there is a fearfulness and a reluctance to put the self out there for other kids to see in full. And if that's going to be the case, there's no way out, right? And so it's this really delicate time, I think, for kids. How do we encourage them and not force them in a safe kind of way to put themselves out there when they missed like 3 years of an opportunity to do that, and then all the trepidation and anxiety that comes with that feeling, right? For those of us who didn't have to go through something like COVID, and we went through high school just normally, it was hard enough putting yourself out there, and think about all the anxiety that came with that. So, I think sometimes we just try to forget that whole thing ever happened. I understand why that's the case. But one place we can't afford to do that is with kids, because I think the data very clearly shows that we need to take some time to be very empathic for what that was like to be 7 years old, and miss out on those things. So, yeah, it's a great question for us to think about.
Want me to go ahead? Okay. This is a great question, and I have two things I want to share on it. One, on Monday, I'm doing a Holocaust curriculum at my children's day school, and I'm teaching 5th, 6th grade. It happens to be all boys. And the topic was actually empathy, and I am teaching the Holocaust in a different way, which is that learning about what happened, but then what are the superpowers that we need to develop in order to fight such forms of hatred? And one of those superpowers is empathy. So for them to understand what is empathy, I asked a few questions. And the first one was 2 parts, which was journal and write down a time when someone did something that hurt your feelings. What was it? And what were the feelings that you had? And all these boys, 10, 11 years old, and I said, can anyone share what happened? None of them would share what happened to them. And the shame, I felt terrible, right? Because here I am, a teacher trying to empower them to be empathetic. The shame that I could see in their faces, they all had something, obviously. Someone was mean to them. None of them would share what happened. I said, okay, pause, take a breath. What did you feel when this mean thing happened to you? And there was sadness, disappointment, anger, frustration, and I was like, that's it. Like, so let's remember those feelings. And then I eventually tied it, like, do we ever want to make anyone else feel badly? Like those feelings you just described. So that was a really, it's hard for young people to be vulnerable with their feelings. And there are practical ways to get them in touch with them, like journaling, and they don't have to share them. But that act of writing down something and reflecting on it, being asked by a trusted adult to do so, there was a lot of power there. I saw there was a little bit of a shift and a transformation, and they felt their feelings. Like that was, especially for boys, that was like really important, and I think that was a success in that lesson. I would say, there's a little plug for Women's Voices Now. I'm sorry, but it will be very practical and useful, especially if anyone in the audience is working with teenagers, ages 13 to 18. We have a program called Girls' Voices Now, where we have teenagers make films about the issues that matter to them, 14 to 18-year-old girls, and especially the films that came out of the COVID summers, because we went online. It was a lot about self-image, social media, looking at yourself on the screen and what you see, all those different things. Film is such a powerful tool for everyone to feel their feelings, because it's one step detached, right? Like, it's other people having those feelings that you see yourself reflected in that mirror. So if you're looking to help young people, I would go to Girls' Voices Now on the Women's Voices Now website and look at the films and see what young people, so here's my call to action. Go watch those films and see what youth you can bring them to, because I've seen the power of the healing and just opening up even channels between those young people and older people who are in their orbit, and that dialogue between those of us who have been around a bit longer and those who are younger is also very empowering for those youth to be seen, felt, heard. They need empathy for themselves, and we have to be able to empathize with them, and them having that channel back and forth is often the key to that transformation that they need to carry on with life and be successful.
Anybody else?
I'm just going to add really quick that, so in a research study, I'm working with colleagues at UC Riverside. We're researching pre-adolescent Latina girls and their brains over time. How does it change, especially in relation to symptoms of anxiety and depression? So one thing we're looking at is that the effects of parental socialization, how do parents communicate with their kids, what do they tell them socially, not just educationally, not what they learn in school. And one thing that we see is that kids' brains are very malleable. They change, they're very plastic. So the parents and their socialization, their interaction with the world is very important. And what we see is that some kids who are not adapting as well, who are struggling, maybe who might not have as much self-compassion, over time, their brains show more anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms. And a lot of research shows that this lingers on to adulthood, right? Childhood brain affects our adult brains, so the way that our brains respond. And some of the things we find, of course, this is a very specific population in Southern California, in the Inland Empire region, but something that we find is that parents' socialization about their food, their culture, their music, talking to their kids openly about things is actually really helpful. It is helping kids with their stress levels at school, their anxiety levels, and these kids, even at 9 or 10, they actually don't necessarily understand things like discrimination. They can't name. When we ask them, what is your race? Sometimes they're not black, but some of them say I'm black, some of them say I'm white. It's just like you get these random answers. They don't necessarily have the idea of this is race, this is discrimination, this is bias. But when we ask them, how does this make you feel? Or how are your interactions with your friends? Have you ever had any negative things at school? They're able to respond. So their bodies are still processing that, and it's still affecting their brains, even when they're not aware, or they don't necessarily put a label. And the way their parents handle this, the way their parents communicate with them, socialize them, embrace them, that really matters. That's really affecting. So that's something we're still testing longitudinally. It's a longitudinal study. Of course, we don't know the long-term outcomes, but the study has been going on for a couple of years, so we know that this is really important for kids that are right now our group is about 9 to 12-year-old kids. So I think that parenting style that's embracing things, that's helping them, maybe making it fun, also learning about food, learning about music, learning about cultures, maybe different cultures. I think these are all very useful resources, I would say.
Thank you. One other resource, if people aren't familiar with the framework of nonviolent communication, I think this is very helpful. So the way that works is observations, feelings, needs, and requests. So sort of speaking to this, give people an action item, right? When I see you, whatever I feel, what I need is safety or trust, etc. I teach this in class, and to your point about people, the impact that this, you're speaking about young men and teaching them. I teach this in class, and one year there was a young man in the back who, before it was even time to share, shot his hand up and said, "I don't know what my feelings or my needs are." And I said, "Yes, good." And by the end of that semester, totally fluent. So just saying these can be learned. All right, we have a student question next. I'll let anyone take this who wants to. So how do we bridge the gap between empathy and forgiveness for those who've wronged us?
Can we define forgiveness? That, to me, that I struggle with the meaning, the definition, I mean. So how would we define forgiveness?
I don't want to define it for the person who wrote. Does the person who wrote it want to say?
Well, I guess just more my question was moving to a point, like we can have empathy to a certain point for someone, but for those who have wronged us or we have like really trouble, maybe moving past it, like in a way that we can interact with them in a way that is not filled with hate. It's not really quite forgiveness, but having interactions with them to a point where it's not a forefront.
If I can paraphrase, so sort of like using empathy as a tool to a point where you can interact with people who've harmed you. Without kind of that feeling being at the forefront of that interaction, those negative emotions. Yeah, is that fair paraphrase? Okay.
Yeah, can I go for it? All right. So, and please anyone jump in if there's something that comes to mind. So I think this is such a great question, and it's a very difficult question. And I think for those of us who've been hurt a lot in our life by people who are maybe close to us or are supposed to care for us, sort of that the boundary was betrayed, right? I think that's often, and especially if we are empaths and we maybe overfeel other people's feelings and can't let that go, the moral boundaries, etc. I think that you can still have empathy for someone and the way that they have behaved, and it's not about justifying their behavior, but it is about explaining their behavior. I think it's important to understand why to have empathy for someone who's harmed you, to understand why they did it, but never to justify it. And then once you can understand the explanation, and you integrate that, it's satisfying to you, then you can move to the next step of saying, they've wronged me, and I just won't let them into my inner circle anymore, right? Like they sort of are in a different, they're long range from you, and you don't allow them into your space in a way that maybe you used to. And so you can hold the empathy for them as a human being, right, and have compassion and understanding that things happened in their life, that they behave this way, but that doesn't have to affect my homeostasis and my well-being. And it's just it's a muscle you have to strengthen over time, right? I think that's my answer to that question.
Maybe I'll try and take it to a global level. We talk a lot about the global north and the global south. I think you could pretty easily say the global north has wronged the global south pretty severely. And I hear from people in Africa a lot talking about conservation. It's like, wait a minute, you killed several million buffalo, and here we are, the logo of this university is the buffalo. You killed several million buffalo. You've destroyed all the animals in Europe, and now you want us to save our animals and tell us we can't develop our country and bring our people up to a standard of living that you have. how dare you? I mean, that's a fair question. So how did those folks find understanding for people from the north coming and saying, hey, we want you to save all your animals? That takes a huge amount of understanding on their part and trust building on those of us who do think that that's important. And you could take it more locally too, and the statement when we started the panel about the indigenous community. I hope those aren't just words that we read. I hope we mean those. I hope we really live those. And I think that's an example of forgiveness. We have to ask forgiveness of people that we want to, if we want an action like saving a landscape or nature, we have to have understanding for what that means to the people there, and how that might affect them economically, socially, and all of those things, and then have essentially ask for forgiveness and ask for understanding and build trust relationships. A lot of what I do is spending time building trust relationships to try and achieve conservation goals. So I think, anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, next question. I'm going to kind of group these together. They're related, so I hope that's okay in the interest of time here. Two most visible examples of conflict are Gaza and Ukraine. How can the apparent lack of empathy on the part of large groups, Russians, Palestinians, Israelis, be overcome? So that's kind of a specific application of this other question, which is a little broader, talking about general divisiveness in the world and why isn't there more work done using empathy to bring opposing sides to come together and stop battling, finding common ground and reaching solutions? So I'm lumping those in, so if people want to speak to either the specific examples here of Gaza and Ukraine, or to kind of the problems and why there aren't more solutions in general.
Yeah, I see it as there are levels and levels and levels. And people's empathy, their feelings, oftentimes I find it in the right place. There are a lot of people who empathize, who feel, yet we still have these conflicts. No, there's wars, constant wars, because at the geopolitical level, like the global north-south divide, there are all these systems and structures, just like structural racism versus interpersonal racism, right? They're different things. And I think without changing the structures, both ideologies and structural forces, I don't think the individual level empathy, changing that is going to be sufficient. I don't think it's going to be enough. Unless we change the systems, unless we understand what needs to be changed politically, economically, like money-wise, our resources, where does money come from, right? A lot of wars fuel economy. Economy thrives during wars. Unless we understand it and we actively try and change it, even though I study interpersonal empathy as a social psychologist, neurosociologist, I always say it's not enough to change just people's minds, just people's feelings. It's very important to do it. It's very important to do for us. But if you want to change systems, if you want to stop wars, we need to change systems.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, we really do need systems change. We do need to work at that personal level, and I think that's what a lot of the focus is, but we have to, as a society, as a culture, as a human society, I don't mean an American society or a Colorado society or whatever, but as a planet, we need to, and that sounds like, wow, how could we possibly do that? Well, we can do that. We do express those values. I wonder how many of you have even heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm always amazed at how few people have actually heard of that, even though that's something the world has countries of the world have signed up for. 30 by 30, 30% of land, 30% of sea by 2030. We won't make it, but it's a great aspiration. That's in expressing a global human value that we're empathizing with the planet, that we think that's important not only for our relationship with other species, but for ourselves. And yet, most of the actions, there are people working really hard to achieve those things, but there are many more people and our systems, or particularly our economic system, that are not set up to achieve those goals. In fact, they're working counter to those goals. Even though we've gotten together as a global community in global forums and said this is what we want to do, we're not including other people who have very different goals that are not going to lead us to achieving those goals. And to me, that's empathy writ as large as it can be writ. So,
yeah, well, you know, one thing I'd just chime in with is that I think sometimes it's hard for me, for example, to empathize coming from a place of privilege, because if you're coming from a place of scarcity or a place of threat, it's really hard actually to empathize. Empathize is this, I sound weird all of a sudden, I feel like. Empathy is this larger, very sophisticated thing that has to happen. If you're under scarcity or threat, it's actually really hard to do it, you know? And so I think having empathy for that position that people are in sometimes is another important step.
I agree with you, though I have to add, I've been in tiny, small villages with extreme poverty in Africa and seen some of the most empathetic people I've ever met.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it's just like when it's like on the verge of starvation or, you know, imminent threat.
And they'll give their last crumb to their neighbor.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I would say, or I want to respond, systems are made of humans. I agree systems have to change, but we are, you know, systems are not AI, the ones that we're talking about. So we do have the power to change them, and it is on us to change them. So I do strongly believe that it comes down to our individual work that we do to become empathetic creatures, and just, you know, we are all interconnected, right? Maybe you have to take some magic mushrooms to really feel that, but like we are all connected truly to the dirt and the roots and the sky and the clouds, and you know, and it takes a lot of meditation and different kinds of modalities and practices to really tap into that interconnectedness and to love, you know, like all of these things are really the key to our salvation. I strongly believe that. Now that doesn't really translate in a briefing room on Capitol Hill where like powerful decisions are made. So that's just a thought to share. And then on the Sustainable Development Goals, number 5, which is the only one I have memorized, is gender equality. I truly believe that we haven't given women the chance, women haven't taken the chance and opportunity to fully express their points of view in the world and to exercise their power. So I think, you know, diversity in opinion in policy making is crucial, that we need to have, you know, proper diversity around important decision-making tables. And, you know, we don't know that it will create that better world, but we haven't given it a chance, so why not? You know, we're kind of running out of options and we just seem to be on the hamster wheel coming back to the same thing again and again and again. So try it differently. What's the big deal, you know? Yes, and so that's my main point, is that systems are made of human beings. It is in our individual power, and I do think empathy is the key to creating that systemic change that we need.
Great, thank you. And to the end of this question here that sort of says, why isn't there more work done, right, using empathy? I just want to say, I think there is work being done. There are a lot of really amazing organizations, and I won't list them all, and I'm not a paid sponsor, but I just wanted to bring that up and then maybe use that to fuel a question for closing. I've been thinking about what Ty said about how good that feels when somebody's enthusiastic about your joy and the joy of empathy, right? And so I wonder, kind of in closing here, if we could have each of you share from your research or your work or your career in this field of what you think are the things you could leave people with that are the most optimistic about the state of empathy or our capacity to grow that or to bring that into the world, whatever that might be, to kind of leave people with whatever you think are the most inspiring and optimistic nuggets you've seen. And I'll take the superlative off of that, because superlatives are hard, so not the most, just a pretty good one.
Yeah, I want to start. My biggest optimism comes from the students when I teach. When I teach and maybe you see it too, like when we talked about teaching in large lecture halls, big rooms, that's where I have my best interactions, and that's where I get my faith for humanity, and I'm like, yes, because we're gonna be all right. I see it in them, because a lot of the time times I see that our students, especially when I teach undergrad students or when I interact with younger students, younger people, they have this passion, they have the empathy, and they're passionate, and you see it, they're motivated, and you see that joy in them, and it just motivates you, it bounces back to you, and it gives me back optimism, and they soak it up, they learn, they're motivated, and I see that in them, and I see a lot of younger people also doing grassroots activism. They're motivated, they're involved, and Heidi, you might know it maybe from your organization as well. So I see it, and that really brings me joy and value, and I love it. So that gives me optimism to going back and being in touch with the students. I think brings me just like, I become optimistic. I'm like, yes, there's hope for humanity.
I'll say two things. One, so I work at an institute, and I said something about engineers earlier, but I'm so excited when I see the kinds of applications we get from engineers, and particularly those with AI and machine learning skills. They can go and make absurd amounts of money from people like Google and Amazon, and yet they're choosing to come to work with us and for us for a percentage of what they could make at those places, because they say they want to do something that makes them feel good, that makes them feel like they made a difference in the world, and not just help Google improve its ad clicks by 1/100%. So they want meaning. So that's a point of optimism. And then the other thing I would point out is I feel tremendous sense of optimism and satisfaction when I see that the technology that we're developing to help people in the field, and I think specifically in Africa, to empower them to figure out how to manage the areas and the wildlife and the nature around them, rather than just imposing a solution on them and our values on them, but empowering them, and then seeing the smiles and seeing the sense of joy that they have when they realize that they have agency and power to actually make a difference. Those two things give me tremendous optimism.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about a number of things. I think, sometimes we can get pretty down on things. That's kind of our tendency these days with social media and so forth. But I think there's been tremendous advances as well in empathy. If you think about how much more aware we are of the land that we stand on, if we think about gender, sexual orientation, race, and the conversations we are able to have now, the vocabulary we even have now versus 15 years ago, it's actually tremendous. And like with Gen Z, for example, they're incredible. Like that's just how they talk, And they're like, why are you guys making such a big deal out of this, And so that gives me a lot of hope as well. I think the last thing is that, I work a lot with helping folks who are socially awkward. And here's people who have just a hard time with executing some of the skills. And they can learn it. And everybody, just about everybody, can learn it. So we can all get better. We just have to be motivated to do it. And the tools are out there with enough persistence and enough will.
I echo all of your positivity, and I experienced the same thing, so just to amplify everything that all of you just said. And I would say that finding the positivity or the hope, the promise of the future, I have to look for it every day, right? And so what I work to do is, I consume information and the state of the world from my smartphone and my computer and podcasts and things, but my lived experience day to day completely rejects the sadness and the desperation and the hopelessness out in the world. So I look to, so I look for those interactions day to day. Smiles, thank you, please, open the door, just the decent kindness that we can show to each other as human beings. And I look for opportunities every day to practice that. And quite often I receive that back. And to me, that's the best hope for tomorrow and beyond.
Thank you all so much. And I hope that all of you out there can feel that joy and optimism in your empathic connection to us in this moment. And I want to thank you all for being here. I know your time is valuable. There are a million places you could be right now. And thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you, Annie.